I won't spend time on why poverty is persistent, except obviously it's related substantially, though not wholly, to incomes. It's also related to lack of access to services, including health and education, which also will be discussed in the next panels, as well as perhaps here. And of course, access to support services and credit are major reasons why it's so difficult to actually address the problem of poverty at the individual or the household level. In India, over the years, and I mean this is near 35 years, there has been a good understanding. I actually disagree a little bit with Mr. Rajiv Kumar in his perception of what we need to do to address poverty. Actually, we have over the years very substantially improved our understanding of why poverty persists and perhaps what needs to be done to tackle some of it. Whether we have a complete solution or not, only time will tell. But broadly, you can categorize the approaches into the direct approaches, which address the poor people and their families and the ecosystem directly, and the more indirect approach, which depend on putting enabling systems and drivers in place in the general economy. It's a bit like a tide lifting all boats, but you provide a slight pro-poor bias that enables the poor to be lifted a little higher. That is the broad approach of the indirect approach school. So I'll now come to the these two types of strategies. The first, of course, is the rural employment program strategies. In the Niti Aayog document that has been circulated, it is called a core of the core. Actually, I don't agree with that. To me, it's more like a band-aid. Because rural employment strategies provide subsistence for people to remain alive and manage through difficult times. It does not necessarily provide them the technology to fish, as it were, to actually improve their conditions and improve their livelihoods and their incomes. But be that as it may, over the years there have been very substantial improvements over the decades in the way we even approach rural employment programs. We started with the Food for Work, and then the NREP and the RLEGP, the SGRY, and today we are in the age of NREGS. And the main changes that have taken place is to move to a more demand-based system with more self-targeting, and to build also the natural asset base. And what this has done is it has removed many of the problems associated with an artificial identification of the poor. The self-targeting is a very good way of ensuring that the administrative deficiencies, for whatever reasons, do not keep the poor poor. And to that extent, though it may, of course, add to leakages, it may add to higher expenditures than required, I think we are at a stage where it's much more important that the anti-poverty program is inclusive rather than exclusive. To that extent, a self-targeting approach is the right approach. But it still needs to be improved. Particularly, the improvement is required in the panchayat level, which is doing the planning, the execution monitoring, and the management after the assets are created, including maintenance. Maintenance of created assets is today one of the weakest points in NREGA. Now, coming to self-employment programs, in my view, and here again, there's a slight divergence from the Niti Aayog document. To my view, it's self-employment that is the core of the core. It is this that will enable the poorest of the poor to rise sustainably above the poverty line, subject, of course, to problems arising out of health shocks and so on. And here there's been again very substantial improvement starting from the IRDP of the 1970s to the SGSY of the 1990s to now the NRLM. And this is an area which actually needs much more push. And in my perception, the self-help group movements, particularly women's self-help group movement, advocated through the NRLM is probably the best example of sustainably bringing the poor out of poverty. And the 3 or 4 southern states which have really done well in terms of poverty reduction, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Andhra, have substantially done this on the back of self-help group movement. And I think this is something that should be really mainstreamed. Currently it is not seen as the flagship. Or it is seen as a flagship, but it's not given the kind of attention and the kind of importance it really deserves. The third area, which is the indirect approach, is the rural infrastructure. The minister mentioned PMGSY. I've been associated with it. I absolutely agree. In my view, it is an anti-poverty program, not infrastructure program as is being classified. It has worked brilliantly, and I think the government is doing the right thing in pushing it further. It needs to be deepened, broadened. Other programs need to be converged with it. Actually, it's probably one of the reasons why we actually have seen poverty rates fall. The point to be noted is those red areas in the map are where PMGSY roads have not come up. And they have not come up because of various reasons, including lack of capacity, including left-wing extremism, including inability of contractors to actually execute work to the required standards. So there are huge problems there of capacity which need to be addressed. There are supporting systems which are also coming into play, which are bringing the indirect approach, leveraging the indirect approach. I'll not go into the depth of it, but the minister also mentioned the SPM National Urban Mission. It has huge potential. Right now it's at a pilot scale, but it is something that has enormous potential, particularly as we urbanize. Urbanization is inevitable. Urbanization has huge potential to reduce poverty because of compactness, but it needs to be managed in case it is to be used for poverty reduction, and hopefully this scheme can actually help do that. And the problem again is the panchayati system. The panchayati system is very weak in exactly those states which are red. And it's not a coincidence that the weak systems, weak infrastructure, weak governance, all combine to keep the poorest states poor. This is not normally mentioned in the context of poverty, but it is extremely important, particularly for rural poverty. Land reforms of the 70s were conceived to help the poor, particularly the tenancy laws. In addition, certain programs for land development, particularly watershed development programs, were assumed to help maintain and sustain the natural resource base, not only the private lands, but forest lands, common property resources on which the poor depend, in order to improve their livelihoods and increase their resilience. One of the problems of the change in approach is today, I'm talking about the current dispensation, is a change in emphasis from dry lands and rain-fed areas to irrigation. There's no doubt about it. You need to realize the irrigation potential to the maximum. It provides a kind of resilience against climate change. It improves the productivity. It enables you to achieve food security and so on. But very often, one of the problems of poverty is whether we are analyzing changes in strategy in relation to its impact on the poor. And I think one of the problems we are seeing here is a reduced emphasis on degraded lands, on dry lands, on rain-fed areas, which are also, by the way, very often in these very states. Not all of them, but in many of the red states are quite high in degraded lands. In this, actually, there are 2-3 things, some of them out of the box. Contract farming and land leasing can add to farmer incomes, even those in with uneconomic holdings. Watershed programs can improve the natural resource base and improve resilience of the poor, particularly in the light of climate change impacts. And though it's not understood so easily, but regulatory and governance issues such as land survey and records and land titling actually can help the poor by improving the land market. And it's possible by Aadhaar seeding and by blockchain-based databases for land records to actually make the land record system much more transparent and much more friendly for the economy. So the overall strategy has to be a mixture of indirect and direct, but what mix we do will determine how we are able to manage, and it may be a state-to-state kind of mix. And there are many problems. Panchayati Raj are problems. Excepting maybe Kerala and West Bengal, the panchayats are actually too small. In Kerala and West Bengal, the panchayat size is 25,000. In Madhya Pradesh, average is 2,000. In 2,000, a panchayat can't even employ a JE. And therefore, to expect the panchayati system to be a partner in development in this stage is actually impossible. Restructuring of the panchayati Raj system, impossible though it sounds, has to be an essential part of the eradication of poverty at that last man that the minister mentioned. 2 other things I'll just leave on the table without elaborating: social audits and the socio-economic caste census. Both have enormous potential. So in sum, a successful poverty reduction strategy is one in which the need for the direct approach diminishes gradually. That is a test we must apply. We have to integrate the poverty reduction strategy with the general economic strategy, not have it as an add-on. Thank you. So now I quickly change hats, and I will request Dr. Rajesh Tandon. I don't know whether I kept to my word of 10 minutes, but irrespective of that, I will have to request him.
I'll follow you. 12 minutes and 30 seconds.
Okay.
I can send you a presentation. It's lovely.
Okay.
Good morning. Thank you very much for, first of all, organizing this focused consultation on the question of poverty. And secondly, there are various ways these days PowerPoints are prepared, mostly powerless and pointless, but anyway. I'm delighted to be here in this panel. I heard a bit of what was being said this morning. I bring to you slightly provocative view of what we are up to. And having worked on issues of IRDP, as Vijay Kumarji mentioned, and even did some skill building under TRISEM in those days, and DWCRA, because a lot of you may not even remember the full form of development of women and children in rural areas. I want to do some plain speaking based on my experience. Very many economists can tell you more about what is poverty, where it exists, vagara, vagara. Multifaceted, multidimensional, complex nature of poverty. There have been jokes that, academic jokes in fact, that the business of poverty attracts more studies than anything else. Even in earlier versions of EPWs, there have been series of this. I want to start by saying end poverty in all its forms everywhere, as SDG 1 says, is a utopian slogan. Please do not bother about it. Certain percentage of poverty exists even in those countries which have 10 times the per capita income that India has. And those which have 20 times don't count their poor because they don't see them, like Switzerland or Sweden. It is true, and thank you, Vijay Kumarji, for showing that lovely map. That map hasn't changed significantly in the last 40 years, by the way. I call this entrenched socio-geographies in India for decades. And the first studies that happened on that map were 1960s. At that time, they were called Bimaru and included a large number of states, some bifurcated, trifurcated since then. Some people would continue to include Odisha, some would drop it out. But fact of the matter is that